Hello and welcome to Tadaima 2022. We've been talking about memory this week. My name is Julie Abo. I'm a member of the Tadaima Steering Committee, and I'm really excited for this next panel titled Hidden Memories, Seeking the Histories of Japanese Americans with Disabilities. This session is inspired by the national expert on Japanese Americans with disabilities past and present, Selena Moon. She has taught me so much in the few times I have met her. We also have two other speakers, Sam Mihara and Andy Aoki, who I will introduce later. Selena is a self-described hafu who has been researching Japanese mixed race and disability history since attending the Manzanar pilgrimage on a college field trip 15 years ago. Her current project is Disability and Mixed Race in the Camps, and she's working on several children's books about disabled children in the camps and hopes to publish children's and adult books about Japanese American mixed race and disability history. So, Selena will start us off with your story and your research.
Thanks, Julie. My name is Selena Moon, and I am a visually impaired hafu. I started my research in mixed race history after attending the Manzanar pilgrimage for a college field trip. And several years after graduating, I met the same professor at a reunion event who mentioned that Asian American disability studies was a thing. And over the next 15 years, I encountered several disabled Japanese Americans who were in mixed marriages, but didn't really get into the disability research until about 5 years ago when I attended the Manzanar 50th pilgrimage. And one of the exhibits was on education in the camps that included education for disabled children. And I was absolutely stunned and got into it, especially after finding out about educational programs for disabled children in the camps. And Hannah Takagi, who was a deaf incarceree, testified about her experiences in the camps, and most of it were naturally not very good for disabled people, and especially the children who languished in the camps without an education for many years. And that piqued my interest, given the difficulties I would have had I been born in that time and place. And as I was researching, I noticed also that there were a lot of articles about disabled soldiers, about various activities that other disabled incarcerees did, such as blind incarcerees teaching each other Braille and so forth. And so over the years, that exploded into research on Japanese American disabilities as a whole, especially as, despite disability history becoming more diverse, it's largely left out Asian and specifically Japanese Americans, many of whom were involved in things like the ADA movement, civil rights, being the firsts of various things like breaking barriers with education and certain jobs and entering the military and so on. And even things like military history leaves out disabled Japanese Americans. So I really wanted to bring their voices out and to talk about their experiences. And I'm really happy that I've been able to connect with so many wonderful people who've been willing to share their and their families' experiences as well. So otherwise, I could go on and on and on. So I think I will leave it at that and let everybody else join in.
Oh, thank you, Selena. I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit more about those stories that you uncovered. So next up, we have Sam Mihara, who I've had the pleasure of working with at Heart Mountain. Sam is a national lecturer on the topic of mass injustice in America, and as a child, he was a prisoner at the Heart Mountain, Wyoming detention facility. He now speaks all over the country and overseas on the history of mass incarceration of over 125,000 people of Japanese ancestry. His home base is UCLA, And Sam is the winner of the prestigious Paul A. Gagnon Prize in 2018. And in 2022, he was awarded the JACL Japanese American of the Biennium in Education. So today he will share with us his story about his father's condition while incarcerated at Heart Mountain incarceration site.
Well, thank you, Julie. I appreciate it very much, and welcome everyone. To tell the story about my father's blindness, I need to go back in history to Japan, where the problem with my father, by my father, started many years ago. The Mihara family came from a place in western Japan called Shikoku Island, which is across the sea from Hiroshima. And my grandfather was a working class person, and his skill was making miso. And my grandmother also worked at a textile factory using a foot-operated textile machine. So they both worked very hard, and they knew they had to work hard to get my father a good education in order to get him off on a new career with a better life, preferably in the United States. And so they sent him to Waseda University. And while my father was at Waseda, he majored in English, which required a lot of reading. And he was reading one day, and he noticed on his right eye, the words and the lines were all scrambled. They didn't make any sense at all. So he went to the medical department at Waseda, and they told him he had early stages of glaucoma of his eyes. And during that time, and by the way, they gave him roughly 20 years before he will become then totally blind. He went to on Sundays, he would attend a class with an expert on religion, and in particular Christianity. And he remembered in that course, there's a passage in the Bible that said, for people who have needs in life, look to God for guidance because God needs you. And he remembered that. And so he found a purpose in life by doing things regardless of his handicap. So what he did was he had thought at one time about committing suicide because when he heard the news, it was incurable. But then he looked to the Bible and he found there's a way to survive. And that's what led him out of the dilemma. So when he came to San Francisco, he worked at a newspaper, a bilingual newspaper, writing English articles. And then our family went to camp at Heart Mountain. And I watched him. His blindness is getting worse. He was in San Francisco, he was seeing an expert, the head of the ophthalmology department at UC Medical Center in San Francisco. And that doctor gave him a procedure, did a procedure to make sure that he maintained his eyesight. So well beyond the 20 years given by the doctors in Waseda, he was able to see because of the skills. And as a result, in the camp, the General DeWitt would not let him go back to see the specialist. And as a result, I watched and my father became blind. Very unfortunate. But that's what happened in the camp. But he was very productive in the camp because of his training. And in the second part, I'll talk a little bit more about what happened after the camp. But the point is, it was the lack of adequate medical care in the camps that resulted in his blindness. So, Julie, back to you.
Wow, Sam. And, hopefully you can tell us a little bit more about your father's story. Um, so, next up, we have Andy Aoki. He's a professor of political science at Augsburg University. He teaches courses on American politics and has published work on immigration, Asian American, and other ethno racial politics, multicultural education, and popular culture and politics. Currently, he and two colleagues are working on a book on Asian American politics. And he's here today as the father of the famed Paralympian Chuck Aoki, wheelchair rugby player and former wheelchair basketball player who currently plays for the United States national wheelchair rugby team. Welcome, Andy.
Thanks, Julie. Well, as Julie said, I really am very much a fill-in for the better option, but unfortunately, Chuck could not make it for reasons that I'll explain a little bit later on. Before talking about him, though, I thought it would be useful to give a little background, kind of connecting a bit to some of the times that Sam was talking about. And that actually I can do better than Chuck because I know that history a little better than he does. Chuck's grandparents, my parents, were also in the camps. My dad was family was in Minidoka. My mom's in Amachi. My dad's father actually was one of the group arrested by the FBI and was sent to the Justice Department camps. So he was moved around. I think he was in Montana for a while, then in New Mexico. At one point, I think he despaired so much of ever being reunited with his family that he actually applied for repatriation. If this were a movie, we'd have dramatic music coming up now because the whole arc of my family was in the balance there. But unbeknownst to him, the appeals board had just agreed to hear his appeal at the very time he was applying for repatriation, and they agreed to parole him, as they say, to Minidoka, and he immediately withdrew his request. But it was really a pivotal point for my entire family's life history. They eventually moved out to Portland. 1950s. By the time I came along, going through school in the 1960s, the post-World War II racism there was really so thick you could cut it with a knife. In the neighborhood where I grew up in school, I see today concerns when sometimes racial epithets are heard in school. And when I was growing up, we never would have even mentioned it. It was just like the weather. There was no point in complaining about it. And so when my kids are born, that was a real concern of mine, remembering my experience as a youth. But then as Chuck started to grow, other issues came up for us, which connects to the theme of this panel. And if we could get the first slide, I have a slide here, thanks. So when he was born, we didn't notice anything, but at the point, about 18 months, we discovered he had a very rare genetic condition. He had no sensation below the elbows and the knees due to the lack of myelin sheath. It appears that there may be 4 or 5 other people in the world with this condition, which is to say it's very rare, and really no one was sure what you do about it or how you approach this. And so it was a learning experience. There were no experts because there weren't enough cases to know what you do. I remember one occupational therapist saying to us, well, he'll probably take longer to read because he's got to learn how to do other things, which is fine. Doesn't matter when he learns to read. As it turns out, he taught himself to speed read when he was about 2 years old. So that particular prediction was a little bit off base. But people just couldn't understand the way his brain was developing differently. So there was a lot of learning because of the lack of sensation. Most importantly, he couldn't feel pain. He injured himself a number of times, so he periodically had to use a wheelchair. But other times he was just doing things that other kids do. There's a picture of him riding his first bike. But by the time he got to about 7th grade, his doctors thought, he really should use the wheelchair full time because of the injury problems. And that was really a turning point in his life. There are different aspects of identity. People today, of course, talk about intersectionality, the way different types of identity intersect. But for him, the disability really became prominent. The fears I had about race were really much less by the time he got to school. The world had changed, not completely, but significantly. But the disability really marked him, set him apart. The school tried to do what they could. But today, many, if not most, folks with disabilities are significantly marginalized. And even though he had good friends in school, there were things he was just either excluded or could not be fully included. And he talks about the struggles he faced. And it's hard even to talk about today as a parent, the way he was really trying to figure out where he fit in a world that didn't seem to have a place for him. He loved sports. He gravitated to sports. He played able-bodied sports at first, and then he moved to adapted sports. We were fortunate that we have a wonderful facility here in the Twin Cities, the Courage Kenny Rehabilitation Center, back then just known as the Courage Center. And so he got involved in that. There was a visionary leader at the time, Sharon Van Winkle, who knew the way that kids with disabilities were excluded and marginalized. And she did everything she could to try and help them really assert their place in the world. And I think that helped shape Chuck. But the ancestry, while it was important to him, it really receded compared to the way that disability shaped his life. He was fortunate to find the Courage Center and really to find a community there of adaptive sports. In fact, his closest friend to this day he met through adaptive sports at the Courage Center. And that's really become a big part of his identity and his experience. If we can move to the next slide here. Today, he's an elite athlete, and to get back to, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, he couldn't join us because he's in Denmark right now. And in the upper right-hand corner, there's some partial evidence of that. That's a promotional poster for the World Wheelchair Rugby Championships. Those are 4 of the top 6 or 7 athletes in the world. Chuck's there at the front, the bottom there. Last year, Sports Illustrated put him on the cover. You can see that in the left top before the Tokyo Paralympics. And then the U.S. team chose him as one of the co-flag bearers for the opening ceremonies in Tokyo. That's in the bottom right. But he very much realized and been shaped by his disability experience. And as he's become more prominent, has tried to be a voice for more inclusion. The lower left-hand corner is a photo of one of his visits to the White House. That actually was a more ceremonial visit, but when he went there for a celebration, the ADA, they don't have good pictures, so I just chose the better picture. But he's tried to speak out about that because he understands this struggle for inclusion is really continuing. And so getting back to my point about intersectionality, his ancestry continues to be an important part of his identity, but the disability component has really shaped him much more. If you're curious about the next part of his story, you can Google World Wheelchair Rugby Championships. We might have a link we'll drop in somewhere because they play for the championship against Australia tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. Pacific, 9 a.m. Central. It's a little bit early, but one reason he couldn't be here is he just finished the semifinals just a few minutes ago. Interesting enough against Japan. But I'll save anything further for our group discussion. I'll turn it back to Julie.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Andy. What an incredible story. Wow. So rich here, so rich here. So many histories and stories that we need to hear. And you telling your stories, I think, hopefully will encourage others to come forward with their stories. One thing we wanted to ask you, Sam, if you could just talk a little bit more about your father and your lived experience with your father in camp. And I think you had a little bit to tell us about what he did after camp.
Sure, be happy to do that. And by the way, I forgot to show some photos of my story. Kimiko, can you start with some of the photos? This is a family photo taken around 1940. And that's my father holding me on the right. I was about 8 years old. What's pretty clear is notice my father's eyes. He's looking at the camera, and people who are either blind or near blind, they have difficulty looking at a camera. And this clearly shows that the special ophthalmic surgeon at UC Medical Center was able to maintain his eyesight, clear evidence that he was able to see going into the camp. Next slide. Here's my father then after he became blind, and very, very difficult time trying to figure out how he can make a living to support his family. Next slide. Here's my father learning Braille, which is the only way he could communicate. First thing he did was he learned the Bible in Braille. And the next slide, he invented a Braille system for the blind people. And it's all in katakana, so it makes it easy to put on a board all the important characters of the katakana language. And then the next slide is my father having gone to a training school for learning how to use guide dogs. And then he went on to write books. So anyway, I wanted just to show you those as an example. So if you can take that off, and let me start out by simply pointing out what he did during the camp. He was very busy, and what he did in the camp, he wrote a dictionary. This is a 30,000 word dictionary. It's all in English and Roman letters, and you can look up a word and find the equivalent Japanese word. And it's in English, Roman letters. For example, the word toilet. In his book, it says toilet it really means benjo in Japanese. Now, if you were around in 1942, you understood what a benjo is, but people today don't know what you're talking about. And so it needs a revision. But the point is, in those days, that was the language. And that's the book he wrote for people who can read English but don't want to learn the 30,000 characters of the Japanese kanji. And so that's an example of what he did. He also wrote several other books while he was busy. He wanted to learn, he wanted to use his skills that he has in his brains. And so after camp, when he went back to San Francisco, he started a school in our house. We had a huge house. He converted a room in the back to a classroom, and he taught war brides who came from Japan. There were some like 30,000 war brides who came from Japan. Many of them lived near San Francisco. They wanted to learn English, and they wanted to become U.S. citizens. And so he wrote a book on how to become a U.S. citizen. And it's in Japanese, and so the people from Japan can learn very easily to learn the language and to become a citizen. So those are the things, examples that he did. He opened a store, a bookstore and a stationery store. So he did many things in order to survive his handicap. And fortunately, it worked out well. And of course, he got married and I was born. Thankfully, I wouldn't be here today if that didn't happen. So thanks to my father who went through all of that. Thank you, Julie.
Oh, thanks so much, Sam. And Selena, I know in your research you found out a little bit about some of his students, I think. Is that right?
Not very much. I found one or two students, and I'm actually talking about this in the article I'm writing. There's so little information about most of the people. They just somehow, I don't know if the census records can't be missing. They just have to be there, but I'm not finding so many of them. And interestingly, obviously there were disabled Japanese Americans from the beginning. The first batch who came over in 1868, by 1870, there were people disabled who'd been working on the sugar plantations. And I only found one or two examples of that afterwards, although I'm assuming it was a very dangerous job. But they just don't come up in the records unless they're in an institution. Because even though the census records occasionally would talk about disability and have special schedules, they just don't exist otherwise. You have to go into those schedules to see that. And so even finding stuff about camp with all of its documentation and the ethical issues therein, just was hard too. So trying to, but not quite succeeding as well as I had hoped. But I found a couple, so that was great to be able to tie into.
Yeah, maybe you could talk a little bit more about that. I mean, so, what are some of the reasons why you can't find the information? Obviously, there's discrimination involved there. And what are some of the other strategies that you've taken to find information? I mean, I think a lot of it, you've connected with a few descendants, but I mean, that's difficult.
So, problem number one is I am a disabled independent scholar who lacks the financial and otherwise resources to do this. There aren't a lot of grants for independent scholars, and what are have like 1,000 people applying. So, they only fund
Right.
the NEH, for example, only funds like 8% of the grants. And so getting that support really
Mm.
would be beneficial, but since I don't have it, hinders my ability to do it. I would literally have to go through all of, say, the WIA records, the military records, just all kinds of things that I can't get. Not to mention, I've actually also written about this too. A lot of the archives don't categorize disability, or the disability archives, for example, at Gallaudet University, the only liberal arts college for deaf people, doesn't really talk about minorities, for lack of a better term. Doesn't categorize people by race or things like that to make it easier to find them. The lot of how I found people was mostly interviews with deaf Japanese Americans, and as I'm finding, there seem to be more deaf Japanese Americans than blind Japanese Americans, at least judging by, say, for example, the children enrolled in deaf and blind schools. There's a lot more deaf people. Proportionally in the camps, there seem to be more deaf people, and people, especially mentally disabled people, are all but left out of records unless they're in institutions. And physically disabled people didn't really have those same sort of institutions to attend. So they're not really in the record either. So it's only in the camps that I'm finally finding examples of, okay, once the camp started the schools, they've got lists of kids with physical disabilities. And of course, many of them they tried to fix because, it was bad that they were disabled. And so they would send them out of camp to have surgery to fix orthopedic issues and things like that, which is a whole other ethical thing that I won't get into. So it's been hard to find resources in that sense. And as much as I keep hearing that Asian Americans hid disabled people, that's not true. Parents sent their kids to school. A lot of the deaf children, said their families would insist on their kids being oral, so speaking and lip reading instead of signing, but there really wasn't that stigma as much as I keep hearing about disabled people. So that's been good to know. But I just need to find the information. And of course, doing this on my own certainly isn't making things any easier.
We need to get you some assistance.
Yes, I do.
Well, let's talk a little bit then, about past being present. Both Selena and Andy. I mean, you know, having difficulty finding information, finding people. How about even talking in our own community, about people with disability? I mean, I think I think we need to shine some light on this, and there could be some further conversations. What are some of the challenges you're having, and but what it sounds like you're also having uh, some victories as well, or finding allies.
Yeah. So, there were several disabled Japanese Americans, and a lot of the times the interviews are done by family members who will talk about the disabled family member and say, they especially had a hard time in camp. It's all of a paragraph out of a 20-page interview. And, I'm finding a lot more ableist slurs that people keep, family members using against other family members, even, more recently in the 2010s and more recently as well. Which I suppose is better than completely ignoring them, but that's also problematic. But it's interesting because I lived in Japan for a couple of years, and the teachers there were very accommodating and did what they could, and I didn't really need a lot of accommodation, partly because, interestingly, the print in textbooks and things like that was pretty big in Japan because I was in the lower grades, and I wasn't discriminated against because I was disabled, because I have an invisible disability. The discrimination from the kids was because I was half. And my school had a class for disabled students, and they weren't mainstreamed, but they were there. They weren't completely shut away. But it was finally coming back to the United States and the culture shock of my teachers be now wanting to accommodate me. They would get irritated at having to provide these services, as I'm sure Chuck must have experienced in school. And sort of, and the Asian American disability history is so new. It's only less than 10 years old, I think, about 2014 or thereabouts when it started. So we're still not there yet in terms of talking about it. And even, as I said, military history ignores disabled veterans, be it disabled veterans who were disabled in combat, be it disabled veterans who served, for example, in the MIS, the Military Intelligence Service, because they couldn't serve in other units. For example, lack of eyesight, physical disability, things like that, that I'm also trying to bring out. And also, the contributions that everybody has made, but not only the famous people, the ordinary people, but they're so hard to talk about because they're the ones who don't have records. You have to be famous to have a paper trail.
Yeah, so it's finding those unheard voices. That's true. Andy, how about you?
Well, I think a lot of what Selena says resonates. I mean, it's the challenges, particularly for people with disabilities, just compound because she points out, getting access to things. So from that perspective, it's even harder. But the information and just there was a real invisibility, as she points out, and that makes it hard to look back and see what happened. I mean, that's why I think panels like this are so useful. I mean, I would be fascinated. I don't want to take too much time, but given that Sam was on the ground and saw that, for instance, I'm really curious how his father, how your father, Sam, navigated the camp. I mean, it's hard enough today. Today, the built environment is still not friendly to people who aren't in the norm, but back then I would think that there would have been very little or anything. So I just, how did he physically just get around, navigate the blocks, get from the barracks, the dining hall, and things like that?
Well, I remember at at Hard Mountain, actually it wasn't too difficult. He had a cane, and at Hard Mountain everything was level. It was there were any problems relative to people who could not see, and especially people with a cane. And so he was able to get around. But there were times when I would give him, guidance. My brother would also guide him. But pretty much he stayed in the barrack. He had a couple of secretaries help him write the book, and so they came to the barrack. And so there was not much of a need to go a long distance in the camp. And he just waited it out. That's all he could do.
Yeah, I guess being confined in that sense was an advantage, although certainly not in the bigger picture. Yeah.
And the point I'd like to make clear is that he kept busy. He always was thinking about, what can I do to make sure the family survives? And he's very creative, write books, and thinks about what's he going to do after camp. Um, and so he was quite busy all the time.
Yeah, so Sam, do you have any questions for Andy and Selena?
Not really. I've learned a lot from them, and hope vice versa. And I'd like to keep up the chatter and continuously. I enjoyed meeting all of you. Thank you.
You know, it looked like there was audience question for Selena about how the community can help with research, and that actually dovetailed with something I wondered about. I don't know how much you know, Selena, but you're talking about one of the challenges for you is you would need to go to the archives, to the WRA records, and there's additional challenges there. But of course, in a small number of cases, you know, we've seen digitization, which has really changed the playing field. And so my question, it's kind of a two-part one, is, you know, do you know, is there any talk about, you know, trying to digitize those things? And then secondly, if there's not, you know, do you think there are things that people in the community could do, you know, to push for that? Because digitization really, you know, would change the world of access for a lot of people.
You have no idea how much that would mean. So I've been looking at all the digitized stuff, and I'm pretty sure I've exhausted everything. Thank God for what has been digitized, because otherwise I would not have been able to do even a fraction of this. And that's why I was so excited after I got to Manzanar, found the classes for the physically disabled pamphlet and stumbled on it online, and I've never been happier. It was the most amazing thing. So now that I've exhausted that, you know, I'll have to go to the archives, but even the archives, a lot of them don't necessarily have them out or don't know that they have them, or, you know, so it's not just digitization, it's the archives needing to go through all of their stuff and label things as disabled or disability related, to make things easier, you know, all sorts of those sort of access. And goodness, if the NARA starts digitizing its WRI stuff, it'll take I don't know how long that'll take. It'll take a lot of money, a lot of time, so that's going to take a while. But you know, other places have, you know, one document that I need within like 30 boxes, you know, all of that. So that'll be something I'll need to do as well. But digitization would just be a godsend. It would be so nice. But then, of course, the other problem is going through all of these things. Because, for example, I'm writing about this too. When I search for things like blind, you know, I come up with ableist phrases like turning a blind eye or turning a, you know, deaf ear or that kind of thing, which is not anything that I need, or things like disabled come up with in relation to, say, vehicles, for example. You know, so it takes so long to find the thing that I actually need on top of actually finding the document. So it's, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back every time. But there's been so much that I have found. So I'm very, very grateful for that. And I would be happy to hear from anybody who's willing to share their experiences, any documentation, anything like that, that would be very, very helpful. And just to get these stories out there, you know, this is all very, very important. And we're losing the community, we're losing all of those experiences that is happening for all, you know, all sorts of historical research, including the incarceration as a whole.
Selena, the other day I just recorded for Densho a 2-hour interview on my life, and including my father's unfortunate experience. But have you thought about looking into Densho's file, if they've segregated people who were in the camps with disabilities? I don't know if you've done that.
Densho has been enormously helpful. Their interviews are so useful. I haven't had a chance to, I've done what I could to start looking through their archives, but they've also got a lot, and I just don't have the capacity at this point. But I found so much through them. I would love to team up with them to go through all of this. I've actually tentatively planning to write an article about disability in the camps for them, which I need to do at some point. So yes, I would love to get in touch. Janum has archives, Go for Broke, all of that. And Go for Broke, you know, obviously has all the military records, but doesn't call out disabled veterans. And so on and so forth. Luckily, I've got access to the military intelligence service because I'm in Minnesota. So all of that is over in St. Paul. Although their archives are actually all in DC as well because they're all the military records. So, so close, but not quite. But talking about Sam's father getting around camp, I mean, I, as partially sighted, would have enough trouble getting around, never mind with a cane. I have not understood how people who use canes can get around because I can't even manage, half the time around my neighborhood, I get turned around, end up where I don't want to be. So that's amazing to me that people can do that.
Well, then in my father's case, one thing he developed is a different skill. For example, in walking around a city street, he developed a keener sense of vehicles that are coming and going across. His hearing went up. His skill of ability to hear sounds has gone up immensely, and he can tell the type of vehicle that's coming and avoid that. So and there's some sense about anything that's moving that you can hear and use other senses you have, and that's what I noticed when he became blind, that he was able to rely on these new skills that he's developed. It's really amazing to watch that.
I've always been visually impaired. I was born visually impaired, and I've noticed too that I've probably got a keener sense of hearing and things like that.
Right.
So it's interesting to hear that can actually develop after becoming blind. One thing I actually wanted to ask Andy was about the Paralympics. We hardly talk about the Olympics, never mind the Paralympics. So I'd love to hear about how that works, how you get involved, that sort of thing.
Well, it's, there's a lot I could say, of course. I'm just going through my mind and editing down to the short version. It's, para, what it means is width. And so it was meant to be an adaptive sport version right alongside the Olympics. And it is very similar in a lot of ways. It is an elite athletic event. So, many are called, few are chosen. And like, elite Olympic athletes, it's really a career. I mean, it's a full-time job. It's very hard to do that without financial support. And most athletes don't have financial support. But it's really wonderful event. It occurs a few weeks after Olympics, the same sites. It takes a few weeks to turn around the sites and add some accessibility and things, and of course just clean up from the Olympic Games. But it really is a wonderful experience. I was able to go to London and Rio. Tokyo, of course, they didn't have spectators, so I wasn't able to go there. But it's a nice opportunity, and well, only certain people are able to be that kind of elite athlete. It's really, I think, given a wonderful outlet and role models for people who don't see them. And Chuck talked about that when he was little. He loved sports, but he didn't see people, as we say, who look like him. They weren't on TV. And I think there's been a real push and some gains there. I mean, Sports Illustrated, this is the first time they ever featured Paralympians, on a cover. It's actually a flip side. Someone named Simone's on the other side. I think she flips around. But at any rate, it's they had never done that before, and then NBC pushed it a lot more coverage there. So we're getting that. And I think that to me is really an important piece there, that there's recognition. There's this whole segment of the population that has really been ignored, and sports is just one aspect. Of course, there are lots of other things, but it's good that we're seeing it in the sporting world, these gains, and some of these major media outlets saying, okay, we're going to start giving a little bit more equal coverage to them, because they're significant sporting activities. And I watched the U.S. Japan. I've watched every game this week. They're exciting to watch. So it's good that we've got that, like the Paralympics, which give people a target. And if you can't make it there, there is more, of course, adaptive sports that give more people that opportunity.
I actually just stumbled on a book called Disability in Sport, and it was actually very fascinating about how the Paralympics came to be and all the organizations that different countries have. So that was cool.
Yeah, it's
That
just a
must
lot
be
of
an
work from
amazing.
people.
Yeah,
Yeah. The community must be amazing. The athletes, the
I'm
families,
sure.
the coaches.
Yeah, it is.
We'll definitely have to have him on next time.
Yeah, he gets very busy. He travels around a lot. He actually was supposed to be at a previous appearance where I was with Selena, but he was invited to the vice president's residence. As it turns out, just to fill you in, Selena, he thought he had COVID, and of course they said,
Oh
sorry,
no.
we don't. But then he got invited back to the White House for another ADA. But he travels quite a bit. He does a lot of public speaking. And then he's got a job right now, so it is, and he's training full time because he's still on the U.S. team. So it's hard to get him in, but yeah, he would be more interesting than me. I can tell you that. So.
Oh, you're very interesting, Andy. So thank you so much. Okay, so we have any other audience questions or any other questions of the speakers to each other? I have a question, but go ahead, Andy.
Well, I just wanted to ask Sam. I mean, I was really fascinated to hear you talk about your dad's experience in the camp and how this is flat. I guess the Army Corps of Engineers just leveled everything. So that mean, but so
Right.
so when people got out, of course, I know from hearing parents and things, they faced a lot of racism. But for your dad, given the accessibility issues, I'm just curious, how did he find that then? I mean, I know you said he got better attuned with hearing, but what did he find it more frustrating with the literal barriers he was encountering, or how was that for him?
I didn't. I don't recall that he was frustrated uh, as much as he kept thinking about
Mhm.
what do I do next and can I support my family better. Um, and actually, when the camps closed, the government forbid him to go back to San Francisco. He was still considered dangerous. So he selected to going to Salt Lake City, and our family moved to Salt Lake City. And his only skill that he felt he could do is to open a store, a bookstore, a stationery store, gift store in Salt Lake City, in the heart of Japantown in Salt Lake City on West Temple Street. And so he did that and tried. It did not work out too well. There wasn't a real large market in Salt Lake City for that kind of work. So after about 3 years, then we went back home, San Francisco. But that's where he really turned on his thinking cap and went through all kinds of creative ways. And he continued writing books. He created the school for people from Japan who wanted to learn English and become citizens. He opened up a store in San Francisco, which started in the basement, and it sold books and stationaries. And then he opened a store in the heart of Japantown, San Francisco, called the Paper Tree. My brother runs it now. Actually, my niece runs it, and it's one of the better stores that handles origami paper in the country. And so they're quite busy doing that kind of work. So he did all of these things on top of his writing books, and so he was constantly busy. Oh, by the way, he turned our house, a 3-story Victorian house. He became a slumlord. He brought in all kinds of people into our house. I remember he converted the living room in our house to a dental office, and he had the dentist live in a room right next to the dental office. And he had relatives in the house. He really packed them in order to help pay for the mortgage. So I have to admit, he was thinking, and that's how we survived. And if I can give an advice to anyone who is disabled, the answer is, be busy. Look for ways to guide yourself to become more proficient, more useful to the society and your family. And that seems to be the key.
I noticed there was a question in the chat directed to me about Chuck's championship game tomorrow and how do you watch it? If you just go up a few notches in the comments, someone had dropped in the link to the website. It's the 2022 WRWC.com. And then you go there, there's a streaming link in the top and you click on it again. It's 7 a.m. Pacific time. And then there's other information, you get the schedule and things too. So you can watch it that way, as I've been doing. It's a lot of fun, and the commentators explain a little bit too, so you don't have to be a experienced fan to be able to appreciate it. There was one other quick thing. Many people confuse the Special Olympics with the Paralympics. Yeah, they are very different. The Special Olympics is a wonderful organization which promotes participation, which is great. It does focus on mental disabilities more. But the idea is we want to get as many people involved, which is really, I think, what needs to be done. The Paralympics is an elite athletic event. Just because you want to, it's just because someone wants to be in the Olympics, you can't necessarily be it. If you want to compete in the Olympic 100-meter butterfly, you've got to qualify. You've got to beat out a lot of other people. And the Paralympics is just like that. So it's an elite event. They're essentially professional athletes at the top of their games. I know there was a question for Selena. I don't know if you saw it, Selena, or it said, tell us more about your parents' emotions and support in your growing up years and now. So I'll turn it to you.
So, luckily for me, my parents are an MD and a PhD who's in the medical field. And I was lucky enough to be born where there were some very good doctors and hospitals. And, my dad actually worked at the hospital I was born in a completely different department. So, and plus it was technology was well enough that I've survived. Had I been born, even 20 years earlier, I would not be, because I was born also premature, which is why I'm visually impaired. And so, my parents were instrumental in getting accommodations for me in school, getting me to the right kind of programs, fighting with teachers about, and, once I got old enough to do that myself, about accommodations and all of that, and the lovely bureaucracy that you have to go through to navigate life as a disabled person. So thankfully that was all there for me. And, for the most part, I'm finding that in my research as well. I haven't really found cases of deliberate neglect because the child was disabled. And, there were some families who were separated from disabled children, and I don't necessarily mean minors, offspring, I guess, when the camps started, because there wouldn't be facilities for severely intellectually and physically disabled people. And unfortunately, at least 2 of those cases, the people who were forcibly incarcerated were killed, partly from neglect and so on. And so, the families were absolutely devastated. They had brought them up at home and, had them as a vital member of the family, and, to have that taken away from them simply because there were no facilities is just absolutely appalling. Some kids didn't go to school, but that was partly because of the distance from the institutions that would have accepted them. And there just weren't, especially for mentally disabled children, there weren't facilities really, in the 40s, 50s. They just didn't have that kind of infrastructure. So it wasn't so much neglect, it was just there was nothing they could do. That said, once the post-camp years started, everybody was a lot more open about disability and getting help for the children who needed it. And 2, my family has been very supportive of what I'm doing. They're worried that I'm doing this on my own and can't make a living yet, so, but hopefully that'll change in the near future. So we're working on that.
Well, sorry I dropped out there, but hey, so that
You're
brings me
back.
up to the next question, which is, what are you doing currently? I know that you wanted to do a little call out, right, Selena, I think? And we could hear from the rest of you too, from Sam and Andy, what your current projects are.
So I am actually, when I'm done with this article on Monday, going to start applying for a PhD and inventing the field of Japanese American disability history over the next, I think, 5-ish years or however long they make you do a PhD. Something like that. Some places I think is 7, which is absolutely ridiculous. Anyway, and I'm also writing, as Julie said earlier, a couple of kids' books. I actually started out wanting to write sort of the definitive history of mixed race and Japanese American disability history for adults, and then through a series of events stumbled on, well, I should write this for kids. And then, I was starting out with middle grade, and then I met an editor at a conference who said, this would make an amazing kids book. Let's take Hannah's story and make it into a kids book. And so Hannah was a deaf Japanese American who left California school for the deaf, and she and her classmates were incarcerated. And as I said earlier, the other deaf children, she, didn't really get an education. And they tried to make a better school at Tule Lake. She was at Manzanar first. And that didn't quite work out. The loyalty questionnaire also closed down the school. And so when the school started, the teacher asked the kids to name the school. And she had read about Helen Keller and suggested naming the school after Helen Keller. The kids said, okay. And the teacher said, write to her. And so Hannah wrote to Helen, and Helen wrote back and, wrote this amazing letter about, how wonderful it was that the children were learning all these skills and how wonderful it was to hear from her. And, Hannah, during her testimony as representing disabled kids who'd been incarcerated, said, that was the best experience of my camp life. She was our only friend on the outside, because there really wasn't support for disabled people outside. So that I'm trying to make that into a picture book. And querying has been an absolutely draining process, but hopefully one day I'll, fingers crossed, be able to publish all this stuff. But that probably won't happen for a while yet. One thing at a time.
Okay, you hear that out there, audience? Sam, I know you're working on stuff. You too, Andy. Go ahead.
Well, in my case, I'm really busy. I was invited to give my first speech by the Department of Justice at a conference, and I found out they knew very little about what happened. I mean, unbelievably little. And so I did more research, and I went on a speaking tour of many DOJ offices in the country. And after that, I went on a speaking tour of school teachers, history teachers. And I've literally hundreds of school teachers asked me to come and give talks at their schools. And that kept on growing. And as of last month, I've done over 500 speeches and given it to over 90,000 students of all ages. And it keeps going. Next Tuesday, I'll be in South Carolina on a tour. And then after that, it'll be in Chicago in the Midwest. And in the New Year's, I'll be talking in Philadelphia and New York area. So there's a huge need across the country, and I enjoy doing it. I enjoy telling people, why only Japanese, and why not Germans and Italians, and could it happen again to others? And in my opinion, the answer is yes. And so a lot of people don't know this history, and that's what I do, and I enjoy it very much.
And you do always include the story about your father too. So I think that's really
absolutely
important. That's so
Absolutely.
important.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, I do.
Yeah, I think it's great what you're doing, Sam and Selena, because there's a lot that's still not known, and
Mhm.
so you're helping to make it known, and that I think is so valuable. I always have a lot of stuff going on, as I think you mentioned, Julie. I'm working with a couple colleagues on a book right now. I've got other more book projects that I'm going to have time to finish, I think. Although I have to say, right now, my horizon is very narrow because getting back to Chuck, he's getting married in mid-December, so
Oh,
I've got
Oh,
to X
congratulations.
out a lot of days
congratulations.
there. So that's kind of the
Wonderful.
immediate horizon, yeah, to try and clean my house and things like that. So
That's very exciting.
yes,
Congratulations.
yeah, thanks.
Well, now, did we make sure we got the information out there so we know how to watch the game tomorrow morning?
It's in the comments, that when they drop the
Okay.
links, yeah, it's the
Okay, great.
2022. Yeah, it is exciting to watch, and I can guarantee you, for the championship game, you'll see a lot of Chuck. He's one of the few players who often doesn't leave the court. They usually rest people, but he's so pivotal to the U.S. that he's usually there the whole game. So.
Wow.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, for each of you, if there were one thing that you want to tell the audience or ask them, or what is one of your hopes for tomorrow, we could just do a little go around, and if we could hear from each of you, that would be really, really wonderful. And maybe we'll just go in the order that you spoke, if that's okay.
All right. Well, my one request would be tell these stories, share these experiences.
Yeah, I completely agree. Telling the story, telling about what happened, the first person view of the experience we all had, I think that's very important.
Yeah, I would echo that and just add that, yeah, the marginalization, the invisibility and being left out, it continues. I mean, it's less than it used to be, but by hearing the stories and people speaking out and doing the work that Selena and Sam are doing, that really helps push back against it, because I've witnessed it, as a parent, and it is very painful for me to witness it. And so I'm so happy to see what people are doing to try and really fight against that.
Wonderful. So yeah, maybe that we could do another session on, how to be an ally. Um, we could definitely use some tips, and I've been inspired by all three of you. I just feel like I've learned so much. Thank you so much for joining us. And if there are any other questions out there, I don't see any in the chat. I really want to thank you all for coming and being with us and participating in this panel. And I want to thank our audience out there for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciate it, and we hope you'll continue to join us later on for more programming of Tadaima. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks